Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I pray that you all are doing well and had a good prayer. Alhamdulillah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought us to verse 226 in Surah al-Baqarah. And this verse is important because it deals with the issue of marital conflict and marital relations. So alhamdulillah, there's a remarkable theme within the Quran, as Imam Majid and others have talked about, of relationships. So one of the things that you look at the previous scriptures, for instance, there's a book called the Psalms, the Suhuf. And part of the Psalms is about praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, talking about how He created the heavens and the earth. But the Quran does that. It talks about the heavens, it talks about rahmah, it talks about love, but it also talks about these intimate relationships that we have with other people, especially our spouses. So in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لِلَّذِينَ يُؤْلُونَ min nisa'ihim tarabbasu arbati ashhur. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this idea of ila. And this was a custom in Arabia in the Jahiliyyah times where a man, he would swear and he would say, I will not get close to my wife. And meaning he would not either come close to her at all, she would live in a different house or in a different room, and there would be no intimacy between them. So you see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala limits this and also condemns this, because what would happen is the woman would be stuck. She wouldn't know if she's married or if she's divorced. And we see that the Mufassirin, they connect this with another verse in the Quran and Surah al-Zihar. قد سمع الله قول التي تجادلك في زوجها وتشتكي إلى الله وَاللَّهُ يَسْمَعُ تَهَاوُرَكُمَا إِنَّ اللَّهَ سَمِيعٌ بَصِيرٌ. The Mufassirin, they say this is actually a link that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemns when a man, in particular, gets upset in the relationship and all of a sudden tries to end it or tries to leave it in a way where it's unclear what the outcome is. And in Zihar, as we know and we'll discuss inshallah later, is when a man will say, you're like my mother to his wife, meaning that you're not halal for me, you're haram, you can't marry your mother. So she'll be immediately divorced and on the street. This is not the divorce of Islam, and is not a proper a separation. As we'll see later, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِمْسَاكُمْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ أَوْ تَسْرِيحُ بِالْإِحْسَانِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, either you are in the marriage, and you hold that marriage and you're good in it, or you separate in kindness and goodness. You do not do the in-between. You do not engage in an abusive relationship. So what the Jahiliyyah men used to do is they say, you're divorced. And sometimes, or they would say, I'm not going to come close to you. And the woman would wonder, okay, am I married? Am I divorced? What's my status? So for months, this would go on for months, and she wouldn't know what would happen. And sometimes the man would swear and say, by Allah, I'm not coming close to you for a year or 2 years or even longer. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here in His wisdom limited this and said the maximum you can do and say is 4 months. You cannot do more than that. After that, as we'll see, you have to decide, are you married or you're not? Are you going to have a separation? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنْ فَاءُوا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. That if you return in that marriage, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forgiving and merciful. So the Mufassirin, they say that someone did al-half, they made an oath, I'm not coming close to my wife for this amount of time. But then if they come back on that oath, then there's a debate, do you do kafara or not? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ultimately forgiving. That if you want, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants the relationship to continue. Doesn't want divorce and failed relationships to spread on the earth. Then you see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the next verse, in our last verse for today, says, وَإِنْ عَزَمُوا الطَّلَاقِ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ سَمِيعٌ عَلِيمٌ. But then after that, those 4 months, if you want a divorce, talaq, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most hearing and the most knowledgeable. Here the Mufassirin, they define talaq, and there's different meanings. And one of the meanings is you're free, basically. As Imam Qurtubi, he says, وَحَبَسَ فُلَانٍ فِي سِجْنٍ طَلْقًا أَيْ بِغَيْرِ قَيْدٍ. So if someone is in prison, and they do not have any chains that bind them in the prison, they're just walking around, then they're in a state of talaq. Also, Fakhruddin Razi, he says, intilaq. In Arabic, you say intilaq, someone's leaving. So if you have to decide after that time, that is she going to be free? Now she's divorced, now you're in a state of divorce, or now you're back in a return. And here the Mufassirin, they also focus on this last part, and this is important when we read the Quran. And one of the beautiful things of reading the Quran and understanding fiqh at the same time is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala connects the Asma al-Husna with the fiqh. He gives the fiqh ruling, and then what? Says, Inna Allah Samiyun Alim. Which is a really powerful, amazing. So you're connecting with the Tawheed. Not sometimes when you go to the law, you go to the DMV or you go to the court, they just give you X, Y, Z, do this, that. But there's nothing about spirituality. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala connecting all of us back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here the Mufassirin say Sami', meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears what's going on in the household. If you say something abusive, if you say something hurtful, sometimes we're nice and friendly outside and at work, everyone loves us. We're cordial, congenial, but at home we're abusive and we say things, whether it's the husband or the wife. And here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, I'm Sami', I hear what's going on, what oaths you're saying, what you're saying to your wife or to your husband. And Alim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is knowledgeable. He knows what's in your heart. Are you trying to hurt your spouse? Are you really trying to reform? We don't have a space in our deen for abuse in our religion. Either you are in the marriage and you're good in the marriage, or you separate peacefully. And inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made talaq halal. And there's even a whole entire surah on talaq, on separation. And this is a qaida that in Islam, we believe in forming new relationships. But we also believe that separation could occur. And in other deens, other religions, there's no talaq. Some of our brothers and sisters in Catholicism, if they want to do a talaq, they have to do annulment. Because technically it's not allowed in their deen. That when you get married, then that's your spouse for your entire life. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala differed and said, no, you can have a relationship, but you can also separate if it's not working out. Of course, we prefer the marriage. Of course, we prefer a successful relationship. Of course, there's many resources here at Adams to make the relationship successful. But for whatever reason, if it doesn't work out, then all of us advocate for a peaceful, amicable separation. Here, the Mufassirin, they cite the story of Umar bin Khattab. And this is really remarkable that all the Mufassirin I read and looked at, that Umar bin Khattab, one day he was out when he was Khalifa. And this is part of the hikmah of Umar bin Khattab, is that he didn't just stay in the palace. Right? He would actually roam the streets at night because he wanted to be with the people, with the sha'b. And this is important in terms of leadership. If you just see a leader sitting in their palace, in their house, but they're not interacting with the normal people, then they don't know the issues. They become detached. So he was walking around one day, and he overheard a woman, and she was complaining, and she was sad. And she was complaining that she didn't have her husband there. And she was saying that I wish I had someone, a companion here at night that was with me, that I could talk to, that I could have some intimacy. And Umar bin Khattab, he went back to the palace, and he asked Hafsa, and he asked his family, and said, who is this woman, and why is she saying this? And she said, this woman, she's married to someone in the army, and they went out to Iraq, and they haven't been back for months. And he made an order and decree, and he said, based on this verse, the longest that the army can leave is for 4 months. Then you have to, someone else has to come. That they have to be returned back to their families. SubhanAllah, what amazing. Based on this, he said that 4 months is the maximum time that we can send our army out, and that the men have to return back to their families because the woman is alone. And what we can learn from this is the importance that even in our travels, SubhanAllah, many of us, mashallah, many of you are accomplished businessmen and women. Many of you travel for work, but we have to ask ourselves, how does that affect the family? How does that affect the emotional health of our spouse, of our children? Do they prefer this? Sometimes people say, I'm going to work for the money, I'm getting the money. But do they really want the money, or do they want your time? Do they want your company? Do they want your presence? So we have to think about this and see what is the balance. Of course, in the life that we live, that we have to travel, we have to earn our living. But at the same time, we have our family has rights on us. Our spouses have rights on us. And we have to make sure that we spend time with them. So to conclude, brothers and sisters in Islam, these two verses are very powerful because they talk about limiting the extremes of Jahiliyyah. In Jahiliyyah, the men would have unlimited wives. In Jahiliyyah, men would just divorce their women and throw them on the streets. In Jahiliyyah, they would just leave their women and they wouldn't know, the women wouldn't know, am I in a state of divorce, am I married? It was unclear. And this is important for us that we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala coming with a sense of justice, of social justice within the family. And this is important because even in our premarital relationships, our youth or young people, sometimes they engage in talking with one another, but it's unclear what the relationship status. Sometimes we have sisters, they think that a brother is interested in marrying them for months, even years, but the brother has no interest. Here it says you have to choose. Are you married or are you going to be in talaq? Don't be in this mutashabihat, in this gray area. All of us have to be clear in our intentions. Are we married? Are we divorced? Are we interested in pursuing a relationship? Are we not? Also, we have to look at the emotional health of our relationships. And then one of the beautiful aspects of the Quran is the ahkam, but then connecting it with tawheed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Sami'ul Alim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all hearing and all seeing. That this is a dua, I would encourage all of us, including myself, that we all call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with this, Sami'a. Sometimes one of the most difficult things is we feel no one hears us. No one hears us. We say something and everyone's ignoring you. We have to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Sami'a. And then sometimes we feel that no one knows our plight, really understands us. We have to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Alim. And then we also have to understand in these difficult moments, in talaq and marital conflict, that we hold on to Islam and we hold on to taqwa. And one, as we know, the surah that talks about taqwa the most is Surah al-Talaq, the surah of separation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِ يُسْرًا. That whoever has taqwa, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make his affair easy. And then other verses in Surah al-Talaq, مَخْرَجًا, that He will give you an exit. You won't feel trapped. So as we're engaging in these relationships, which are difficult and hard, marriage, as we know, is arguably the most difficult and challenging thing. A man or a sister may go to work and make 6 figures, 7 figures, but in the marriage life, it's struggling. And this is natural. And that's why, mashallah, Adams has an amazing support system that all of us can plug into. And during these challenging times, we remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We remember Tawheed, we remember the Asma al-Husna, the beautiful names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we hold on to taqwa. Because if we do that, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us ease and refuge. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.